Welcome everyone to the Knights of Columbus First Understand webinar series, a series of lectures and talks intended to open people's minds and give them the knowledge necessary to make thoughtful decisions for themselves. I'm your host, Donald Patty. In our first talk in this series, we heard from renowned author Dr. Carol Delaney about the sometimes controversial namesake of the Knights, Christopher Columbus, in Columbus Re-Explored. Then we spoke with local historians from the Sugar Land Ethnohistory Society about the historic African-American community of Sugar Land in I Have Started for Canaan. Tonight, we're on to a different topic. Between the challenges brought by a global pandemic to the protests and violence triggered by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, 2020 has been a year of great challenges for many Americans. But perhaps none have been more challenged than law enforcement officers. At the same time, their help is needed to provide aid due to COVID, and their protection is needed during violent protests. Their own lives and careers have never been in greater jeopardy. According to the Officer Down Memorial page, law enforcement deaths are up 90% from 2019 when compared for 2018 when compared to 2019. From Honolulu to Los Angeles to Minnesota and Maryland, law enforcement officers are being targeted for violence simply for wearing their uniform. What's it like to be a law enforcement officer in this age of reform? And how has the situation changed since the onset of COVID and the arrest of George Floyd? How can we best create an environment that is safe and just for all citizens, irrespective of racial background? This panel event will ask law enforcement representatives, family members, and retired officers to give us insight into these and other questions. Joining me this evening are Tori Cook, the president of the Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 35, which covers Montgomery County, Maryland, and Paul Kozik, a retired Arlington County police officer and former instructor at the Northern Virginia Criminal Justice Academy. Tell us, how is a person selected to become a police officer in your jurisdictions? Paul, did you want to leave us off with Arlington?
I can start off. First of all, Arlington requires at least some college, 60 semester hours. There is some substitution that you could have for either military or prior police experience that could get you through the first part of the process. And then it's basically a four-part, and this is probably the same for most departments. There's an application and testing process, the police exam, which is written, and then there's a physical agilities test. There's an interview process and a background investigation. The interview process, of course, to get to the interview and the background, you have to pass the other two phases to get to that point. And you're usually allowed to take it again if you don't make it the first time. And then, of course, the interview process is and the background process is what becomes really important. So the applicants are interviewed on their personal history, their work experience, and so on, just like most other things. And a lot of times what comes up is things that come up in the background investigation. I've heard statistics that only 5 in 100, and that's that actually apply for police work, are actually hired to actually get through the entire process.
Wow.
There's a polygraph examination, which of course goes over a lot of the things. There's a psychological evaluation and so on. And if you complete all that and pass, then you're allowed to go to the academy and train. And I guess we could talk more about that later. But law enforcement officers in the metropolitan area, especially in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., are pretty well trained, probably the best trained, I think, in the country. So, and that's not the case nationwide, obviously, and a lot of that has to do with the qualifications to be able to get hired. Also makes a big difference as to whether or not you have a quality police department and how well trained they actually are. I'll let Tori talk a little bit about Montgomery County.
All right, great. Yeah, and that sounds like quite a high hurdle there. So you said 5 in 100. Now, is that 5 in 100 who make it to the academy, or 5 in 100 who end up making it through the academy and ultimately become police officers?
I'm not sure but yeah, some will fail out, obviously, in the academy. Some won't make it through that. They won't make it for a variety of reasons. We could talk about it a little bit later, but and some of them make it all the way through the academy and then don't make it through field training. because when they're actually on the street and actually dealing with the real stress of the real people and the real job, they find they can't cut it, or their field training officers don't feel they have what it takes.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. So, Tori, tell us a little bit about how Montgomery County is. What's it like to try to become a police officer in Montgomery County?
Our process is similar to Arlington and most other jurisdictions. Basically, the first part is you apply through application, and then once you get the application process finished, they will assign you a test date. You come and take a test, much like a civil service exam, but it's geared towards police officers. Once you complete the initial test, I'm not sure what the scoring is at this point. It's been a while since I looked into applications, but you receive a certain score. They take the higher scores. You move on into the process to the physical agility. You have to complete a physical test first, and then once you pass that, you're put in a pool, and then you move forward depending on your scores there, and then it moves on to a background check and psychological exam, and then once you pass through all that, they have a selection process. They basically it's based on scoring, and how high you score determines whether they choose you or not.
Okay, and that's choosing just to get into the academy, or is that once you're in and go through the academy that you?
Just to get in the academy, and just like Arlington, we have a requirement of 60 credits or an associate's degree. So that's just the base to get in the police department.
Okay. And what types of things typically disqualify someone from becoming a police officer?
Criminal background, drug use. They typically give you a psychological to see if you're mentally prepared to be a police officer, and those type of things. Your financial background, they do a credit check on you, similar to what you would go through for a federal job. So those are the type of things that would disqualify you for a police officer.
Yeah, the thing that will disqualify you quicker than anything is being deceptive in any way on any of the application process, not admitting to a drug use or something like that. Failing the polygraph would do it as well. Sometimes something will come up in a background that they didn't admit to, and then they're questioned on an interview, and maybe they try to hide something, and that will get you disqualified very quickly, because you can't have that before you even start, where you have a problem like that. And like Tori said, if there's a credit check and they owe a whole lot of money and things like that, that kind of can get you into a big trouble too, because if they think that you're going to be a liability because you wouldn't be able to meet your bills, and issues like that could affect your work as a police officer.
All right, great. So from initial application to joining the force, about how long typically passes for a candidate?
For us, it'd be 2 to 5 months, probably. By the time they do, it depends how long the background investigation is. That has a lot to do with it, and how quick, they're able to, how things fall as far as taking the test and things like that. I'm sure it's even longer now with COVID, because there's probably other issues that they have to work around, physical agility tests and things like that.
Okay, and that's for 2 to 5 months to get into the academy, and then how long once you're in the academy?
In Northern Virginia, the academy is 6 months long, and I can talk more about what goes on there, but it's 6 months in the academy. And of course you have to pass the academy to move on and become into field training. And Arlington will spend 4 to 6 months. It depends on the department. Some departments are less than that with field training. Arlington spends a lot of time with their field training officers, making sure that they're up to speed. A lot of times the field training officer, when they're ready to get cut loose, the field training officer won't even wear a uniform. He'll just be in the car sitting there so that he doesn't participate in any of the calls unless needed, obviously, but so that the rookie can handle all the necessary calls and all calls for service and so on.
Ah, good, good. So an opportunity to get some experience with someone there to be able to help you out if you need it. All right. How about Tori on the Montgomery County side? What's the typical length from initial application until you end up joining the force?
It can take anywhere from 2 months to 6 months, depending on how many candidates they're looking for and how many candidates they get. So generally, we have classes from about 25 to 30 recently. Prior to that, we've had classes as large as 60, 50 or 60. It just depends on how many people they're looking for and how many applicants they get. So typically 2 to 6 months. And depending on how many classes they're running, it could take a year because they may choose to put people in different classes.
Okay.
It's a little different with Northern Virginia because we have 17 agencies that attend. We have a multi-jurisdictional academy. So we run we run 2 classes a year. One begins in July and one begins in January. And each one, the numbers depends on how many are from each agency hires. And we've had as high as, I believe, 120 or more. I think we've had up to 140 in one class. Now they're way down now. They're probably down at 60 or 70, and that's 17 agencies because of the difficulty in hiring. A lot has to do with the current climate, obviously.
Gotcha. And jumping things back over to Tori again. So once someone's on the force, their training doesn't end. What types of ongoing training are usually available to them, or are they asked to participate in?
Once you complete the academy, we go through a field training program, much like Arlington. I think ours is 26 weeks, where you get the on-the-job training, and you take what you've learned in the academy and apply it to real life situation. During that training, you can be extended. So if you're having a little difficulty, they can extend you for a period of time. Usually, academy to FTO, we probably lose 3 to 4 people on average. There are some years that we have some decent recruits that make it through the whole thing and the whole class will make it through, but that's rare. So it's intensive. So you leave the academy where it's a safe environment, then you have to apply what you've learned in the academy out on the street.
All right, thank you. And how about on your end, Paul?
It's about the same. You know, academy training is different from, like, say, going to a community college. Now there's the education part of it. Like, for example, legal, you have to pass and you have to know legal. I mean, you cannot be a cop if you do not know the laws, obviously, and all the the Constitution and Fourth Amendment things and things like that. So you have to know that, but there's also patrol skills that you have to acquire and be able to demonstrate that before you even get out of the academy, where they'll do a lot of simulation training, learning how to handcuff, all those kind of skills-based things. We will sometimes lose officers because they can't pass some of those things, or they can't pass firearms, or they can't drive a car. Some of them actually have difficulty with motor vehicle operation. So they have to get through all those things, and that's a pass or fail when they're doing the training part, the practical exercises. And I believe they'd have to score at least 70% in their written exams all the way through. And there's the state of Virginia mandates certain courses that you must, certain questions on exams that they must get right. If they don't get them right, then they won't pass the test, even if they do well on the rest of the exam. So as far as after training, after you're certified, you're a police officer in Virginia, you are required to get 40 hours of mandatory training every 2 years.
Okay.
At least 4 of those hours have to be legal and 2 hours have to be cultural diversity. It started with cultural diversity when I was going through. Now it's a lot more implicit bias type training and things dealing with more of the racial issues as opposed to just understanding different cultures. Um, uh, but it's a lot of implicit bias and things like that. And that's been going on for at least since 2014, 2013, where it's kind of shifted from cultural diversity to more towards the racial issues.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move on. So now we're on the force. What's a typical day like for a patrol officer? Tori, did you want to open?
Yeah, I can open. Typical day for a patrol officer in Montgomery County. It depends on where you work, which station you're at, but pretty much each station you're going to have calls from anywhere from domestic violence calls to robbery calls to theft calls, and a lot of self-initiated traffic. So most officers, we report in the morning or afternoon or evening. So we have 3 shifts right now. We have a morning shift, then we have a afternoon shift, then we have what we call a midnight shift, and those officers work overnight. We work 10-hour shifts, so 10 hours, 4 days on, 3 days off. Once you get in, you go to roll call. Roll call's set up to catch you up on the events of either earlier in the day or yesterday's events. And once you clear roll call, you go on patrol in a beat. We break them down into geographical areas where within a district. So it also depends on what beat you're in. I worked in Bethesda for a while, and I worked in when I was there. They've since changed the beats, but they call it an Edward 2 beat, which was out near Potomac, that area off of Falls Road and down in Seven Locks and that area. It was a relatively slower beat, so you didn't have a high volume of calls versus a Silver Spring or a Wheaton, where you're at any given day, you're probably running calls from the start of your day to the end of your day. And a lot of it is, and what people don't realize is a lot of it is report writing. So that's one of the more important critical blocks in our training is writing reports, being able to provide the information necessary to move on to the different units within the police department. So burglaries would move on to a detective, homicide would move on to a homicide detective, and those type of things. But you have to have the base report in order for a detective to figure out where they need to go next. So a typical day is a lot of traffic, domestic violence, and other related calls like robberies and stuff.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tori. How about on your end, Paul? Do the officers on the beat typically see the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, Montgomery County is very similar to Arlington County. You got areas that are commercial districts, and you've got residential, affluent areas. Modern policing is driven by crime data and community demands for help. So the size of the beat and the number of officers in certain areas is driven by the calls for service. So, in certain sections of Arlington where there's, we have a lot of commercial activity or traffic accidents, you're going to have more officers work in that particular area. Or in some of the areas where there's, higher crime rates, you'll have more officers working there. But then when you get out to the more affluent and more residential areas where you get fewer calls for service, one officer might handle a much larger beat all by himself. because he's just not as busy because as opposed to some of the busier districts, busier parts of town. Of course, Arlington is so much smaller than Montgomery County. We're only 5 square miles, so someone from the very northern part of our county could be at the very other end of the county in 5 minutes. So backup for a serious call is a little bit easier for an area like Arlington, but it's much more condensed, more people, and more everything is all a lot of volume of people, and crime follows where there's mostly a lot of people, obviously.
All right, thank you. So both of you mentioned traffic stops and service calls. On the traffic stop side, what types of traffic stops typically are occurring?
It depends on it also depends on the area. If you're in a more dense area like in Wheaton or Bethesda, then you're probably going to have more traffic stops that deal with red light violations or speeding, those type of traffic calls. But I mean, you handle a little bit of everything. Most of the self-initiated is looking for speeders, looking for different traffic violations that would occur to basically protect drivers. So you're probably dealing with a lot more speed than anything else. And in the dense populated areas, you're dealing with some other issues related to traffic. But when you get out further to the residential areas, you're mostly handling traffic complaints, which would come in and be generated by the community. And typically what they're seeing, like traffic not stopping at a stop sign, or running running red lights in a certain area, or those type of things. So it varies. It really does.
Okay. How about on your end, Paul?
Yeah, it's the same thing. A lot of self-initiated. You just happen to see something. You see somebody run a red light right in front of you, and you make the stop, or somebody runs a stop sign, or obviously traffic accidents. You're issuing a summons a lot of times for who's at fault. But a lot of it is generated by complaints from the community. People who live on a certain street say people are always speeding here, so you're assigned to work traffic detail on this particular street. Or a school zone is another place where you get a lot of people will complain that, in this school zone, people are not going. It's really hard to go 15 miles an hour in a speed, and people don't even realize that they're going that fast. But they may only be going 30, but in a school zone, that's fast. So and it's hard to stop for a kid. So a lot of it's generated by the complaints in the neighborhood, and it's also generated by how many accidents. There's certain areas where we may have a whole bunch of pedestrians struck, or a whole bunch of accidents at a particular intersection. You'll be detailed to watch that intersection to make sure that people are following the rules and not allowing pedestrians and so on. So it depends on complaints and incidents that have happened in that area.
All right, thank you very much. And so we talked also a little bit about service calls, and both of you mentioned domestic violence. I had the opportunity probably a good 25, 30 years ago to do a ride along, and the officers that I was riding along with probably made a good, I'm going to say 4 different stops during the 3 or 4 hour time window I was with them for domestic disputes. Is that pretty common to have quite a few domestic disputes that an officer becomes involved in?
Yeah, it's a very common call, and it's a very dangerous call, because you never know what's going to happen with it in a domestic dispute, because it could be an abusive husband, and it could be some kind of child abuse kind of case. And officers are required to be able to take action, especially if there is any evidence that a husband beat a wife or anything like that. And, of course, the important part is getting those parties separated so that whatever happens doesn't continue to happen. And it's a very difficult call to handle, because a lot of times you may make an arrest on a husband who has beaten a wife, and the wife decides she doesn't want to testify a couple of weeks later. So this becomes a problem. But domestics are always scary call, because you never know what could happen. You never know what kind of weapons somebody may have in a house, and there's such tension and high anger, and it's very hard. You have to be very good at de-escalating the situation. That's one of the things that most police officers get pretty good at, with handling domestics, but it's still a very dangerous call for officers.
Yeah, Tori, thank you, by the way, Paul. Tori, was what I saw something unusual? Is it a little different in Montgomery County?
No, what you saw is pretty typical. A normal day, you could probably run 3 or 4 or more domestics. Not only just domestics, but just assault calls in general, or neighbor disputes, or parking disputes, those type of things. So you get a lot of those. And it is important for an officer to be able to diffuse a situation, to de-escalate when they're dealing with people who are angry and really angry at each other. And in certain situations, the person that's in a spousal situation, you'll find that if you do take action, sometimes the spouse will turn on the police officer, and the police officer is trying to help the spouse. So they are the most dangerous that you can handle. And in terms of training, we get a lot of training on handling those type of situations where it involves people who are having confrontations.
Okay, very good to hear. Thank you. So you both mentioned that there's a possibility someone might get taken into custody. So roughly how often does that happen? Is it something that's pretty frequent, or is it relatively rare?
In Maryland, you're required to arrest if there are signs of physical assault. So if someone's showing signs of being struck, or of some type of like a cut or something, where the person is saying the other was the aggressor, then you have to take action. You're going to have to make an arrest. And sometimes you are required to take action on both parties, because both were hitting each other or striking each other. So it becomes complicated at times, but the law requires you to intervene at a certain point.
Okay. And Paul, is it the same way in Arlington County as well?
Yeah, it's the same in Virginia. You're required. That's a lot of the domestic abuse. A lot of them were probably in the probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when it became a requirement that you had to make an arrest. Because prior to that, you could separate the parties, but what would happen is something could happen 3 hours later and somebody gets really hurt, and if you didn't make that arrest, or didn't take the action, then obviously you're in a position where you just don't look good. So you're required now, and like Tori said, sometimes you end up arresting both parties.
Okay, so let's assume we're in a situation where an officer actually has to take someone into custody. So what kind of techniques are available to them to be able to manage that situation?
Well, all officers are trained in all different kinds of arrest procedures. Obviously, if somebody is going willingly, it's pretty uncomplicated. You put the handcuffs on and search and go on. But you're allowed to take whatever is reasonable, as far as the only enough force that's reasonable. So obviously you can't do something beyond what is necessary to affect the arrest. So and you're trained in various forms of less lethal, either certain takedowns or certain holds to be able to control somebody so that they're not able to hurt you or hurt another person in the situation.
Okay, thank you. Tori, similar situation in Montgomery County. What do you typically see, and what techniques might be available if they need to take someone into custody?
Ideally, you want to use, like Paul said, as little force as possible. We train to have enough people to address any kind of subject that's going to be violent. So first, you start with having enough people to take the person peacefully, and then if the person doesn't go peacefully and the number of people can't handle that one person, then you move to your less lethal force options, which would be taser or ASP or something like that. So it's really dependent on the officer to use their best judgment when dealing with a person and trying to get them into custody. They teach handcuffing techniques. They teach defensive techniques. So there are things that you can use. You just have to know how to use them and when to use them.
Okay. Thank you. And we have a few questions that are coming in from our attendees. We'll get to those in just a second. So I have one more question before we jump into those. This was actually a question I can distinctly remember being asked when we had a law enforcement officer visit us when I was a kid for career day. How often does a typical officer actually fire their weapon?
Statistics are that most officers never fire their weapon. 75% of officers go through their whole career without firing their weapon. I spent 28 and a half years, I never fired my weapon.
All right. And
I was in a gang unit and a narcotics unit.
wow.
Never fired my weapon, and anybody I was with never fired their weapon either. So maybe I was fortunate, but I think that it's pretty typical. I think it's about 25% actually have to use their weapon at some point, and I was fortunate enough not to be one of those that had ever had to use it.
All right. And Tori, on your end, similar statistics?
Yeah, about the same. You'll find that more officers fire their weapons to dispatch a injured animal than anything else. So the only time I've fired my weapon was to put down a deer that was injured. That's it.
Okay. Yes, we actually had one of those scenarios when my son was very young, so I can imagine that happening. All right. So let's take some of the questions that we've received from our attendees. The first one is from Lori, and we'll direct this one to Tori first. So how has COVID changed policing?
COVID has changed policing a lot. With the precautions that you have to take with COVID, you find officers are making less traffic stops. They're trying to prevent that contact that comes with it. In some cases, you have to, but you're talking about using masks and gloves and all that, which becomes difficult when you're trying to deal with drivers and traffic stops, and then the fear when you're actually on patrol and having to deal with people who may have the disease and may pass it on to you. And what's most concerning is that officers are afraid to take it home to their families. So it's changing in a big way. There's less contact right now with police officers and the public. So they're being very cautious.
Okay, thank you. And Paul, what have you heard on your end in Arlington County? Are there significant changes to procedures or even policies based on how closely police officers interact?
Where there's definitely less traffic stops being made. I know that for sure. But I mentioned to you earlier that I work for the Law Enforcement Memorial in Washington, D.C., and we have had nationwide, close to 200 deaths of law enforcement and corrections officers who died in the line of duty due to COVID. So it's a very real threat out there, and it's something that officers are aware of, and it's pretty sad. I mean, the deaths this year of law enforcement officers is going to be higher than probably 9/11, and it'll probably be one of the highest years ever, because when you add 200 deaths due to COVID on top of regular line of duty deaths due to firearms accidents and so on, it's going to be a tremendous toll on police officers this year.
Okay, I'm sorry to hear that. And I think I mentioned when we opened that statistics were already leaning in the direction of being significantly higher when compared to 2019, even before COVID. So thank you for that question, Lori, and thank you for the response, Paul and Tori. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. Yeah, I guess we'll jump into current events a bit. So as you all know, recently the death of George Floyd in the custody of police and the shooting of Breonna Taylor by police officers and some other police-involved events. Because of these, there's been requests for reform of the police, including requests to defund the police. So these are always difficult questions to ask. So regarding these calls to defund the police, let's start with what do you think would happen if the police were defunded, either in part or significantly?
Well, I think we
go
have
ahead,
experience now with what happens, and they're experiencing a lot more crime in Seattle and Portland and those cities where they've called for defunding the police, and they've actually restricted police in certain ways. I think what you're going to find is that crime goes up. You're going to find that the services that you usually receive from police officers, you're not going to get. And then you're also going to find that the ability to police areas is not going to be that great either, because you're going to lose a lot of police officers. You're looking at New York City, Seattle, Portland. A lot of those cities have lost a large number of police officers due to their not wanting to engage and put themselves in a position where they could get hurt, or whether they could be charged with a crime for something that they normally do, or the training that they rely on is not the training that they can depend on in this age right now.
Thank you. Paul, thoughts on your end?
Well, just the calls for defunding the police and the narrative that's been out there for the last year now, I think they're actually getting what they want, because police departments across the nation are downsized, not because they want to be in some cases. Some cases it is because that's what the political will is, downsize and defund or lower the budgets for a lot of police departments. But officers are quitting, they're retiring. The number and quality of recruits are getting harder to find. So the number of police officers in a lot of jurisdictions is going to be less. And it really doesn't take much to imagine how this will play out. People will still call the police, but there will be short-staffed. The person that's going to show up is probably not going to be happy. He's going to be angry, disaffected, uncommitted when he gets the call. He doesn't have a backup, so he's not safe anymore for what he's doing. He knows that everything he does is going to be second-guessed and videotaped. And it's not hard to realize that, and it's happening. The murder rates across the country are going up because officers are afraid to do their job, because if they do their job, there's nothing worse for a white cop, than to be called racist. I worked in a very multi-racial department, and if any of us were racist in any way, our African-American brothers who worked with us hand in hand would let us know for sure. If we even appeared to be racist in any way, that would happen. So I feel really bad for officers out there because their hands are tied, and I even feel worse for my African American brothers who are cops. I see what people say to them. I mean, they call them Uncle Toms because they're a cop, and what's the answer? To have less African American cops? That's stupid. And I have a personal friend whose son, my personal friend who's African American, who's a cop, and his son is now a cop, and he's like his friends on Facebook are calling him and have said they're no longer friends with him. They don't want to talk to him, and they're really in it. If you're African American, you're a cop. You're getting it from both sides. So it's a really tough situation for all law enforcement now, and I really feel bad for those guys. I really do.
Hey, thank you for sharing that. All right. So there have also been calls to shift funding to other departments, and I've heard some individuals say that it might be beneficial for social services to respond, say, to some of the domestic disputes that we talked about earlier instead of police officers. What are your thoughts about that? And why don't we start with Paul on this one first?
Well, we already mentioned that domestic disturbance are one of the worst situations that a police officer walks into, and I wouldn't want to be a social worker and not be armed to go into one of those situations. Social workers definitely have a part to play in this. They often come in after we do whatever's necessary to diffuse the situation to make sure nobody gets hurt. I mean, we call on social services all the time to be able to handle someone who has, some kind of mental issues or child abuse issues. They take over at that point because we're not equipped to handle that. We're just, cops are not. We're just there to keep the peace before anybody gets hurt. After that, it's a great place for social workers. But social workers just walking into a domestic dispute, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't know how that could happen.
Thank you, Paul. Tori, on the Montgomery County end, how do you all coordinate with social services and child welfare and some of the other departments that are out there in the county government?
We actually have a couple, I'll call them units, but they're social workers that actually assist with issues that we get calls for. Some where you get a call for someone who has a mental disability that someone's called the police on. But when you direct funds away from the police department, you certainly don't have that money to increase the amount of social workers that are on the street with police officers. There are a couple of agencies within the United States. We've done it for a while. We just don't have the money to make a larger unit. I used to work in the child abuse section, and we actually worked along with social workers. We were embedded in the same office, and we went out on calls together. So we continue to do that. I think that to shift the money away from police and put it in a social worker's hands to go and answer calls is dangerous. Back in 2006, I believe, Montgomery County was sending out social workers to handle their patients and by themselves, and there was a social worker that was killed and stuffed in the trash can in Silver Spring. So we need to be careful when we're deciding that we want people who are untrained and unarmed to deal with violence and those that may become violence. Not that you need the police to be heavy-handed with anyone, but you certainly do need police to be security while you're doing an assessment of a person.
Wow. Okay. So, Paul, on your end, are the police integrated with some of the social services agencies and child welfare groups as well? Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. And they're often used in like hostage barricade situations, for example, or ones that don't quite rise to the level of actually being a hostage barricade, where it's just where you need a social worker to be able to talk somebody out of a situation. Yeah, they're used all the time, and they're used with police officers. But to replace police officers with a social worker on an initial call, uh, I don't see how that could work. Um, Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay.
I don't see how it could work.
All right. Thank you. So we've had a number of great questions come through. I promise we will jump to those if we don't already cover them. I know there's a few really good ones in there from the audience. And this is something actually a couple of folks have touched upon already. One of the members of the Montgomery County Council pointed out that there's data showing that minorities are being stopped and arrested in much higher percentages than what you might see with other members of the community. And they said that this is evidence of systemic racism. So in your mind, do you feel there's some truth to these claims about systemic racism?
I'm gonna let Tori answer that because he'd be better one to answer to start with.
I don't believe there's systemic racism within Montgomery County's police department. You can't determine based on the data that they do have. They took raw data. They used the raw data to determine whether African Americans were stopped more than the whites or any other race. And if you don't have certain controls on data and you're not looking to answer a certain question, the data is not going to tell you anything. It's just raw data, and you can make it sound like whatever you want it to make it sound like. So I don't believe that is any proof of systemic racism. Is there racism in racist police officers? Probably so. I mean, you have a population that has people who are racist, and that goes for both African American, white, Asian. We all have our biases, and some of them are racial biases, and we all have to work through that. But as far as systemic racism within the Montgomery County Police, absolutely not.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll follow up with that. I agree 100%. I don't see it. Some of the things that cause these statistics, I think, are as we mentioned earlier, our directed patrols are directed towards places where you get the highest number of calls, and sometimes that is in a minority community. And when you have more officers in a minority, minorities are the highest victims of crimes also, and they want us there. I know a lot of you may not hear that on the national news, but the minority communities that I worked with, they want cops there. They want us to be there. They feel more safe when they're there, and that's where the victims are. So if you have minority victims, a lot of times it's minority suspects, and officers are required to make an arrest when something happens. And as far as traffic stops, I don't know of anybody that looks at the driver on a traffic stop. They see who goes through a red light and they make the stop. Now, I am sure all those statistics, especially on traffic stops, is going to go down because officers now, if they stop a African American doing whatever, running a red light, they're not going to get a ticket. That's because they don't want to be labeled as racist. And that's just, I know that's what's going to happen. Whether that's right or wrong, maybe it is right. Maybe they are overly enforcing areas where African Americans are working, but I know that statistic is going to fix itself, especially the traffic one, because where you have an option of whether or not to write the ticket, they're not going to write the ticket. That's just the way, because they don't want to be labeled as a racist, even though it may have been a perfectly legitimate reason to write the ticket.
Okay. Thank you both. Moving on to the next question. So what types of steps do the police department take to be able to prevent bias in traffic stops already?
I know in Montgomery County, we have training, just like Paul said, there's training on racial bias every year for in-service. We're required to do in-service, like most police officers across this nation. We're required to do a certain amount of in-service hours. And part of that in-service is racial bias. And then we follow up with some other law updates and those type of things. So um, it's difficult um, to determine a racial bias in traffic stops if you're not looking for it. And I know the state of Maryland started collecting the data um, years ago. So there's traffic stop data, but it's all one big data set. And no one's actually tried to do a scientific question on whether African Americans in Montgomery County are stopped more than the Caucasians and in certain areas, because all that data just rolls into one place.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Now, are there thoughts on anything that can be done to even further improve the situation that's out there already?
Training is always cops always want more training. They training on de-escalation tactics and communication skills. One of the things we see, especially with newer officers when I was at the academy, is newer officers don't have the communication skills of older officers. They're so used to being on that phone and not talking face to face with other people and being able to communicate, that they really do have to work on their ability to communicate and to be able to de-escalate situations. Um, but de-escalation is certainly, but more training is always better. Again, when we're talking about our departments, Montgomery County and Arlington, or some of the other metropolitan area departments, the problem is not as great as it would be in some other areas of the country. There are areas of the country where you heard about all the things that we do to get to hire an officer to go through. Some places it's nowhere near that, and they're not paid as much either. So they're not trained well. They don't go through the same training. They're not screened as well when they can become cops. So training, and if there's something that could be done to improve nationwide, maybe some sort of standardized training like Virginia has and Maryland. I don't know about what the state of Maryland does, but what Montgomery County standards are. If you have some sort of standardized that every officer has to get this many hours of this training, that would probably help nationwide. Um, Training, but you're going to have a bad apple. There's no question. There's always going to be, you can't call every cop racist because of what happened in the George Floyd case, and just like you can't say every African American is a criminal. It's ridiculous in either case. You can't label everybody because of one bad situation. That's about it, I guess.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. So moving on a bit, slight shift here. So one of the central themes that we often hear in the Black Lives Matter movement is that police are systematically targeting African Americans. Tori, do you have thoughts about this concern?
I don't believe that police officers are systematically targeting African Americans. And I know that Montgomery County doesn't do it. I know that we are careful to make sure that we police the whole community fairly and make sure that we're not showing a racial bias. So I don't believe that is the case. Now, it does it happen across this nation? It's possible that there are areas police do this, and it's possible in certain areas in this nation that it does occur. But like Paul said, you can't treat every police department the same just because there was an incident in Minneapolis or somewhere else. Each jurisdiction polices their area different than the other. And I do believe that there should be some type of national training for police officers, national requirements, so that we can all be on the same page and we can all police in a similar fashion. But each community is going to want to be policed in a different way, and we should learn how to communicate with our communities and see how they want to be policed and how we should be helping our communities in any way that we can.
Thank you. And Paul, on your end, in terms of the death rate of African Americans when they are apprehended, are there approaches or options out there that might improve the situation?
No, I agree with Tori. I don't. Obviously, more training is always important, but if there's a bad apple in a police department, they should be getting rid of no matter what color they are. There's I think there were I don't remember the statistics, so I'm not going to. The fatal shootings. There were more unarmed whites that were killed by officers than there were blacks last year. Not as a percentage, but just the total number. So it happens. I don't think that the problem is that the things that make the news are is that one bad. Obviously, it's if it bleeds, it leads in the news. So if you have a picture of a police officer doing something wrong, it's going to make the news. Unfortunately, all the good things that police officers do day in and day out that nobody ever sees never gets on the news. So, but certainly training, you can never have too much training, in my opinion. And conversations like this, and the fact that we have departments, and I guess there are not all departments are like Montgomery and Arlington and all Northern Virginia agencies, but we are interracial departments. We have units where we work with other people of other races, not only African Americans, but Asians and female officers. And we discuss all these issues. It happens all day long in our units. We would talk about these issues, and you learn from people of different backgrounds what they went through, and you understand better because you've worked with them. And I don't think anybody understands the issue better than cops, because we work with those people every day and we talk to them. There are so many people in this country that have all these opinions, but they haven't actually worked together with other nationalities and other races hand in hand, day in day. And your back depends, and your life depends on that guy, whether he's African American or it's a female. And so I think that's one of the things that people don't really understand about law enforcement is that we're a family. It doesn't really matter what color you are or what race you are or whether you're male or female. We're all brothers and sisters in that job, and we look out for each other, and we believe in each other. And it doesn't matter what agency you're with either. That really doesn't matter. You're treated the same. If I've gone to New York City on cases, I'm treated like I'm one of them, and that's just the way it is.
All right, thank you. Okay, so sometimes, and I've seen this in my own job as well, rules and regulations can prevent law enforcement from doing their job effectively. So if you could wave a magic wand, what rules or regulations would you change so that police can do their jobs more effectively?
I don't have one.
You don't have a magic wand, or you don't have a rule or regulation you change?
I don't think that there's a rule or regulation that needs to be changed to help police officers do their job. I think that at this point, with the politics that are happening across the United States, the politicians are trying to create policies and rules that are more restrictive to police, which has a negative effect. So if we're talking about Montgomery County just passed legislation for a use of force bill, which in itself is not bad. A lot of the things that they put in the bill, we have been doing for more than 10 or 15 years. There were no chokeholds here. We didn't. We have a policy on use of force. We train on our handguns. We train on different weapons that we use for non-lethal and lethal. So it's a big difference than in these smaller jurisdictions or areas in which they haven't updated their policies, or they're not keeping time with the changing needs of the community and the changing laws. So it's a big difference, and I think that when you're talking about our use of force law policy that just changed with Montgomery County, there are certain things that they put in there that conflict with current law. And it's confusing to police officers. So one of the things was stopping people and how you're able to stop people. It used to be reasonable suspicion. The county council changed it to probable cause. There's a big difference there. Reasonable articulable suspicion is a lower bar than probable cause. And if you had to use probable cause to stop everybody to see if they are involved in a crime, you certainly wouldn't be finding the criminals before they commit their crimes. So for instance, someone robbed a bank and they called the police and said, hey, there's a guy with a green jacket and blue pants and gray sneakers that just left the bank, and they just robbed the bank. You wouldn't be able to stop that person under the current use of force policy by the county. But if you depended on what the Supreme Court has already stated in reasonable articulable suspicion, you would be able to. So there's a conflict there. And I think that the Supreme Court's ruling trumps the local law. But either way, police officers are going to be confused when they have to apply it.
Okay, thank you. That's a really good example. All right. We have a couple of questions. I'm going to make sure I pull these ones in. So one is, what's your opinion on the bad cop registry that's being promoted by some of the police reform groups?
I don't know much about it, but if he's a bad cop, he shouldn't be hired by another agency. If he's a bad cop, he was fired because he was a bad cop, then I don't know why another agency would hire him anyway. So I don't have a problem with it. If it's just because if it's a legitimate complaint that's been sustained, not because somebody said he was a bad cop, that would be a problem. So I mean, if somebody was fired because they did something illegal or improper or against policy, he probably shouldn't be hired by another department anyway. And I don't know why they would hire him. So I don't have a problem with that.
Okay, Tori, thoughts?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with a bad cop registry. The issue I have with it in the infancy stages of developing a law that would provide for it is that any complaint will put you on this list, and that's a big problem, because a mere complaint doesn't say that you violated policy or you did anything wrong. It just says that someone wasn't completely pleased with the job that you did. So if it were, like Paul said, you committed a violation and it was sustained against you, where they found that you did violate a policy, and it was a policy that would, like use of force, you use force unreasonably against someone, then yeah, put that person on a list and don't hire them at another jurisdiction, because they're just going to do what they did before. But I don't believe that the way they have it now, that we should have a list where just a mere complaint can put you on a list.
Thank you. Good insight there. Another thought here that was shared. It's rare, this person says, that we see police officers actually in our communities and perhaps walking out on the streets in our neighborhoods. What are your thoughts on that possibly improving relations with citizens and members of the community and helping to make police officers more approachable? Does that sound like a viable approach?
I think that's the best approach. When I was hired in 1994 with Montgomery County Police, we were undergoing a change, and that change was to switch over to a style of community policing that best suited Montgomery County. And a lot of it was getting in the community, walking around in communities, being more of a deterrent than the enforcer. So I think it has a lot to do with community relations. It has a lot to do with working with the community, and I think it's very important for police agencies to understand that while we are police officers and enforcing the laws, that our main focus should be on serving our communities, making sure our communities feel safe, and doing what's best for our communities. Because not all communities need the same type of policing.
All right, thank you, Bob. Paul, on your end, did you see quite a bit, or do you see the same thing on the Arlington County side?
Sure.
And if not, why is it not used more?
There's always an attempt to be more in the community. I think right now with COVID and with some of the recent issues with police, that I think some police officers do not want to be interact with people in the community. I think there's a fear there that there are some departments now that are requiring that anytime you talk to anybody, you have to document it because they don't want to see that you talk to too many of this race and not enough of that race, and it becomes crazy where maybe you're just it's just a friendly interaction, but you now have to document that you've had this conversation, that you've talked to somebody. So I think community policing is great. I think people, the more interaction you have with other people, and the more they get to see and know you, the better relation you're going to have. Again, I think some of it comes back to communication skills with newer officers. They're not comfortable with it. They're not comfortable with being in the community, I don't think. I think that could be changed. And I would hope we'd get back more to community policing, because I think that is a great way to prevent crime and to also increase your status in the community.
Okay, thank you. Let's go ahead and shift gears a little bit. So what's it like to be a family member of a police officer?
So I was going to talk a little bit about that. Police officers have, due to stress, police officers have a very high suicide rate. In 2019, there were 228 current or former officers died from suicide. There was 172 in 2018. So the number has gone up pretty dramatically in 2019, and I wouldn't be surprised if it goes up even more in 2020. There's a lot of stress with being a cop, and you go from complete boredom to suddenly being in a high-risk call within seconds. Many officers work a lot of hours because they're needed to work, and also to make ends meet. Because especially in an area like this, cop salary is good for a cop salary, but yet for this area, it's not quite what a lot of other people make. So they work a lot of overtime hours, so they're tired. They work traffic accidents. They're involved in, they handle all kinds of calls from rape victims, homicides, domestic abuse, child abuse, hurt kids, dead kids, neglected kids. You're being second guessed. So the stress of being a cop can be really hard on police officers. The divorce rate among police officers is 75%. Less than a quarter of police officers actually, when they're hired, will actually retire with the same person they married when they started, because the wives and spouses and husbands of police officers have to deal with it. Officers bringing some of that home with them. It's very difficult. It's difficult on the kids. If you're, they said during the Ferguson, the Department of St. Louis, I think it was St. Louis County Police Department was one of the main departments on, and they were videotaped 24 hours a day on CNN and the news, and that after that was over with, that a lot of officers left, and a lot of divorces happened because the wives were sitting there watching their husbands and wives, or police husbands watching their wives, and kids watching their parents day in and day out, and being singled out as being whatever, not talked nicely about. So it can be a real tough thing. And, some cops don't tell anything about what happened on the job. And some cops come home and tell everything. I was in the don't tell anything category. It worked for me. Um, but for some, it doesn't work because some spouses want to know everything that's going on. And fortunately, when I was a cop, I didn't have a cell phone, so I couldn't. They couldn't. My wife couldn't call me all day long. I had to call her from a a telephone at 7-Eleven. But today, cops are communicating with their spouses while they're working, and it's a stress all day long. So um, it's tough for family members. It's tough for wives. It's tough for kids, and it's tough for the cop to not bring that home. Um,
Well,
just some
thank you,
thoughts.
Paul. Thank you, Paul. Tori, on your end, what type of challenges are you seeing the officers that you work with face?
Like Paul said, it's difficult. It's a stressful job. Um, we're seeing what's usually cyclical um, with alcohol. A lot of police officers, like everybody else, they're from the community. They are the community. They're just like anybody else. The difference is they do a difficult job and they enforce the law. But a lot of that stress ends up resulting in alcohol use or, um, like Paul said, divorces and those type of things because um, it's hard to deal with everybody else's problems when you have your own problems and you're trying to deal with your own family. It's extremely difficult for some police officers to handle, and some deal with the stress very well. But what I'm finding and what I see is a lot of alcohol use, and then there's suicide, and police officers get depressed just like anybody else. Probably more so with some of the things that they see. I know when I was working in family crimes division, I did child abuse, and so I did both physical and sexual abuse. And it was difficult with small children, and then coming home and thinking about uh, how your children are treated, and whether you want to let your child go to a neighbor's house or a sleepover or those type of things. When you're seeing those things and you're investigating them, and it takes its toll. And if you don't deal with it, and if you don't have a place to go with someone to talk to, you can end up drowning everything in a bottle or taking your own life. So we're working hard here in Montgomery County to deal with suicide prevention among police officers. We have a lot of resources. We're working hard to make sure that those resources are confidential because the biggest thing with police officers, and a lot of them have the type A personality where they don't want to get help. But if you do try to get help and someone finds out, and then all of a sudden it's getting around the police department, they unfortunately feel weak, which is unfortunate for a human being to feel that they're less of a person because they're going to get help. So we have a lot of resources, and we're trying to work through those type of things.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sure there are times where family members wish that you had not gone into the police force. Are there times where they were happy or proud, I'm sure, of you serving as police officers?
Oh, I'm sure there are. Yeah, especially when I retired. No, no. Obviously, they are. There's pictures of me at the Pentagon on 9/11, of course. And they're very proud of things like that. But and realistically, I did nothing on 9/11 other than show up at because what could you do at the Pentagon? But a lot of the other things I did that they don't know anything about. Which they hear about now because I'll get together with friends and they'll be around. My kids are adults now, and they'll hear the stories that we tell now out in the open, and they just look at me and say, "You did that?" I don't remember. So yeah, they are. Um, I'm proud of my job, and I know they're proud also. But and certainly my father, who was a World War II veteran, was very proud also. But um, uh, I think when they were going through it though at the time, I don't think my kids, especially like during 9/11, when they knew I was gone and they were watching things on things like that on TV, and they don't know whether I'm coming back or not. So those things are hard on a kid.
Okay, and Tori, on your end, can you think of a time where perhaps a friend or a family member said something to you that showed their appreciation?
Um, I come from a police family, so I have two brothers that are police officers. Well, one's retired, but the other's still working. My dad was a police officer, so yeah, they were proud. My wife, is happy that I was a police officer, that I am a police officer. And there, yeah, I mean, it's up and down. So and I know for myself when my brother used to work, the ones that's retired work for PG County, and the one that's working currently is Anne Arundel County. And when you hear of an officer injured or an officer involved in something or a shooting or whatever, your heart sinks because you don't want to think that it's your brother or your relative. And I think that's what happens across all police families. That feeling of anxiety when your loved one goes out and off to work. And I know I worked midnights for 12 years, and it was difficult for me to leave my family overnight, especially working nights and having to respond to burglary after burglary, and thinking about, is your family safe? Then your significant other is thinking about, are you safe while you're out there in the middle of the night policing? So it can be very difficult.
Okay. Speaking of that, how likely is an officer to be injured or harmed on the job?
Uh, it's very likely. There are a lot of injuries that you can incur while being a police officer. We've had anywhere from someone accidentally walking on a pool in the middle of the night and falling through, to tripping downstairs when walking, doing burglaries, to getting hit with objects while trying to apprehend somebody, to blowing out a knee while grabbing somebody and twisting the wrong way. So it's easy to get injured doing this job because you're actually seeking out people rather than sitting around and not doing any kind of work. It's a physical job. Getting in and out of a car while running calls is difficult. And as you age, it gets even more and more difficult. We even had a police officer who made a traffic stop and reached back to get a ticket book and pulled or actually compressed a disc in his back. So you wouldn't think of the typical injuries. Everybody thinks of a typical injury of getting shot or getting in a fight and getting injured, but there are a lot of things that you can get injured by doing this job because you're outside all the time and you're getting in and out of a vehicle, you're walking up and down stairs, you're going to see people in different locations. So it's a dangerous job.
All right. And have you, by the way, I was nodding up and down with my head on that because, I myself have thrown my back out in some very odd circumstances. So I could definitely see that happening. So are there situations in the local area in particular where police have specifically been targeted because they're police?
I don't know about locally, but there's certainly been nationwide. There's been a lot of targeting of police officers. Obviously, you don't have to go far to search the internet to find places where officers have been targeted. It's been all over. I don't know of any specific incidents locally, though.
I don't know about targeting. I know our last injury, our officer was trying to apprehend a wanted subject and made a traffic stop, and they knew he was a police officer. And when he walked up to the window, he got fired upon. So I guess you could say it's targeted because the person knew he was a police officer and knew that they weren't going to be apprehended or taken. So it hasn't been. It's been several years. We did have a police officer in Montgomery County, and I think it was up in Germantown, that was called for a stolen bike and responded. And the subject that called themselves the victim, attacked the officer with a knife. So you never know. As far as specifically calling somebody to an address to attack them, that's only occurred a couple times in Montgomery County. It certainly hasn't happened recently that I know of.
All right, thank you for sharing. I'm going to take a couple questions here that are online. So here's one. What are your thoughts about police resource officers in schools?
I'm a fan. Myself, I was a gang detective for a long time, and police resource officers were a great source of information. They have a good rapport with a lot of the kids, and they really get they can really. It's also a form of community policing, as kind of what we were talking about earlier, where the kids can see this officer and sort of the officer-friendly situation where they get to meet and talk to an officer one-on-one and see him as a human being, as opposed to some guy riding just driving in a police car. But also the thoughts of having an officer in a school, I think in today's environment with the possibility of somebody targeting a school, I still think it's a great idea. I know that's one of the places that's being defunded. When they're defunding police, that's one of the places that they're taking them away from. And I'm not a fan of that, obviously, but I'm a fan of cops in schools.
All right, Tori, on your end?
I believe SROs play an important part in the growth of a child. Our SROs are extraordinary police officers. A lot of them have prior either teaching experience or counseling experience. They do a lot in the schools, which doesn't get reported, and we have a movement right now in Montgomery County to remove SROs from schools, and I think it's a bad decision. You have police officers, in particular one that I know of, that I know personally. He's been a help in a lot of lives in the schools. And in one case, there's a young kid that played football. He mentored him. He kept him out of trouble, and the kid actually made it to the NFL. And to this day, still credits this police officer for steering his path. And those stories can go on. And these police officers enjoy their job. They don't act like police officers in the schools. They endear themselves to the kids, and of course they every now and then take action to deal with the kids. But that's any teacher. Any teacher would have to do so. The difference is they're wearing a uniform, and they're a police officer. But certainly, police officers are needed in schools. That is where where kids make first contact in the case of Montgomery County with a lot of these school resource officers, and they do a great job.
All right. Thank you for that question. So closing things out here, if there's one thing that you could change about policing at this stage of the game, what would it be?
I don't know about policing, but certainly we could always, as I mentioned before, we could always use more training. Training is always good, but certainly the political climate, it just feels sometimes as if cops and police are used to advance a certain political agenda. And what happens with the officers on the street is when they don't feel the community has their back, it's hard for them to take the risk of going out and doing their job and taking the risk of making a stop that they don't have to make. Um, because making the stop, yeah, you might find out that this guy was a criminal, but then again, you might find out that you're being accused of being racist or something else. So um, I guess there's not a lot you can do to change it, but if there's one thing that is helpful is these kind of forums, and it's really great to hear from people who will come up to officers and say, "I appreciate what you're doing." So, for those of you that are watching that are not cops, if you see a cop on the street, just say thank you. That means a lot.
Great. Great. How about you, Tori? Anything that if you could make a change about regarding policing, what would that be?
If I could make a change about policing, what I would uh, concentrate on is community policing. I think that more police departments need to work at working with the community and to continue on that path. We've sort of drifted off that path in Montgomery County. We certainly don't police like we did back in the early 90s. We certainly don't um, meet with the community and collaborate with the community as we used to. So I would change that, and also training for police officers. I think the one of the bigger problems with police agencies and police departments across this country is they tend to stay fixed in how they do police work, and they don't try to move out of their comfort zone. And I think if we try to do that a lot more and have more conversations, as Paul said, with the community and hard conversations, because the only way you can get better is to take the criticism that you get and put it into some useful energy and work on getting better and doing what others say would make you better.
Mm. Okay, thank you. And final question from my end. So what's made you stick with it?
Well, I guess Tori has to answer that because I'm retired. But no, I stuck with it for 28 years and then went right into the academy, and I'm still doing law enforcement type work anyway. But it really is a really a rewarding job for all the stresses and for all the negative things. Every time somebody says thank you for some help, helping somebody that's along the side of a road that's with a flat tire, you're able to give them a ride, or able to help them out, or able to help some mother with their child, or being a comfort to some a victim of a robbery or something else, or actually catching somebody or helping somebody solving a crime and being able to help somebody. I mean, it's very rewarding in that respect that you actually do see that you do make a difference. It doesn't happen a lot, but it happens enough so that you feel like you've actually done something worthwhile with your life, that you've made a difference. So that's what keeps you going, I think.
All right. And how about you, Tori? What's kept you going every day?
I agree. I think it's just the work and being able to help people. I'm on the kind of the other side right now. I'm more of helping police officers and less doing the police work. But in what I do, I am able to connect with the community, and I think it's just the ability to help people, work with people, and I think that's what keeps you going. It's a little difficult in the current climate. Because every time you turn around, there is negative stories. There are laws that are looking at being created to go after police officers versus trying to put money where it's needed and educating police officers and helping police officers. I think that's what's going to be important in the future.
All right. Okay, thank you, Paul and Tori, for sharing with us tonight. On behalf of our audience, which has made quite a few compliments already, and on behalf of the Knights of Columbus, I'd like to wish you and your family members and fellow law enforcement officers across the country a safe and quiet holiday. We hope everyone on the call has enjoyed this session for our first Understand lecture series, this one entitled The Price of Being Blue. This is Don Patty reminding you to all take care and God bless. Enjoy the holiday.